Parallel echoes of Nikolai. 5 years ago, Talia was diagnosed with a serious kidney disease. Despite the doctor's efforts, one kidney had to be removed, and the other was partially damaged. According to the prognosis, living with such a compromised organ wouldn't be long-lasting, so Talia was placed on the waiting list for a transplant. Among his relatives, no one was a suitable donor due to health conditions, so they decided to wait for a chance. During this time, my friend's life hung by a thread more than once, only saved by hemodialysis. But then, in March of the year before last, Talia received a call from the clinic demanding an urgent appearance. A suitable organ had become available. I drove him myself and waited for the operation to end. Everything went successfully, and within half a year, we could even share a beer. His new kidney worked like clockwork. In general, Talia returned to a normal human life, and everything would have been fine if not for the strange thoughts that started to haunt him. Initially, it manifested in philosophical discussions on life and death, which was uncharacteristic for Talia before the operation. It progressed. My friend started researching various ways to settle scores in life on the internet. He became fixated on this topic, able to talk for hours about different suicidal cases. Because of these obsessions, his girlfriend left him. She couldn't endure the oppressive atmosphere. I admit I myself began to contemplate ending my childhood friendship with him, but I didn't get a chance to do that. It turned out that Talia disappeared for several days, and no one knew where he was. In the end, his mother decided to start searching and came to his apartment. There, she discovered her son's body. He was lying in a bathtub filled with bloodied water. The investigator said Talia had chosen the softest way to leave life, lying in a warm bath, cutting his wrist, and bleeding out, as if he fell asleep. After the funeral, Talia's mother, sorting through his things, found a diary in which her son described strange visions that appeared to him after the kidney transplant surgery. It was as if he lived in two parallel worlds. In one, he was Talia, and in the other, someone named Nikolai. And this Nikolai precisely dreamt of dying and gradually infected my friend with this obsessive idea. After reading these revelations, I had one hypothesis, but to check it, I had to contact Talia's treating doctor. He responded with understanding and, exceeding his authority a bit, gathered the necessary information. As it turned out, the kidney donor was a man named Nikolai who, in excellent physical shape, took his own life due to a mental illness, and he did it the same way as Talia, in a bathtub with hot water.
The swamp's mysterious sounds. Once I told a story about our acquaintance, whom we don't see very often. Blame it on his exotic job. He studies gases in swamps, their composition, structure, and the conditions of their formation. Quite a job. Being alone in the swamps is psychologically challenging enough, and on top of that, conducting scientific research. Try to imagine that. However, our friend is remarkably calm and focused. Naturally, when he came into my field of vision, I bombarded him with questions about the horrors of the swamps, swamp monsters, blah, blah, to which he calmly replied, "I've never encountered anything like that. The sounds of swamp gases, bird voices, nothing unusual." The topic quickly faded away. But quite recently, in a group gathering, comfortably settled on the terrace, we chatted about life. He finished his work in the swamps, the data was collected, and it was time for the mundane laboratory work at home. And then, he said thoughtfully, "Remember when we talked about the swamps? Strange and incomprehensible." I nodded, not interrupting. He continued, "I said back then that I hadn't encountered anything abnormal." I lied a bit. I raised an eyebrow. "Encountered? More than once or twice. There were all sorts of things." I smirked, saying, "So now you're going to start giving stories about monsters." But our friend, without a hint of a smile, recounted that in his situation, working for a specific employer, it would be reckless to spread rumors about swamp horrors. People there are experienced. They understand perfectly well the conditions of the work and carefully monitor the psychological state of their employees. Just a rumor of strange behavior, and you won't go anywhere else, losing good money. And it's easier for oneself to just close one's eyes to the inexplicable and work. But enough of that. What did our scientist encounter? Unexplained and strange sounds. Oh, yes, plenty of them. Swamp gases escape, and this process is accompanied by very strange sounds for the human ear. The crackle of decaying trees. With the onset of night, this takes on a truly ominous shade. There are truly strange sounds a few times. Once in the middle of the night, a woman's cry, with sobbing, echoed, smoothly turning into a howl, reaching the highest note and suddenly cutting off. In another case, it was a child's laughter, which suddenly changed tone, and the laughter became similar to a man's. Quite frightening. Although the nature of this may lie in the peculiarities of our consciousness perceiving the same sounds of gas escaping to the surface, one would like to believe. Once, our acquaintance, while changing his location to install instruments, saw a house on a small island in the middle of the swamp. An old, dilapidated house, with a scarecrow, And this is absolutely incredible and makes no sense. Hunting lodges are not built in such places. Well, and a scarecrow in the swamp. From whom? Will-o'-the-wisps also, yes. But they are explained again by gases escaping to the surface and phosphorus from the decaying bodies of animals. In general, these are clearly not the places where you would want to have a dacha. According to our acquaintance, the swamps are quite safe. The main thing is to know what you can and cannot do. And one of the rules for him was, if faced with something incomprehensible, never try to figure out its nature. Just act as if you don't notice anything. A couple of times, our scientist heard how something huge, making sloshing and smacking sounds with each step, approached his camp on a small piece of solid ground. It was scary, and only by an effort of will did he force himself not to jump out of the tent and run headlong. The sound died down right in front of the tent. I admire the courage of this man. I would have already built a fence around the tent out of logs, like in the game The Forest. An unpleasant moment for him was just before he left home. For 2 hours, he literally felt the gaze on his back, caught the movement of some mass out of the corner of his eye. And on top of everything, he suddenly wrenched the sled from his hands on which he relied, crossing the most swampy areas. Swamps, an unpleasant place. Just you and the swamp, alone with nature.
Whispers from the Bad Grave. A friend of mine, with whom we studied together at the university, shared a story. The boy was very devout and had a tense attitude towards stories of this kind. However, one day he told us the following. His grandfather served as a caretaker in a tiny town on a cemetery. The cemetery was ancient, Polish, and Catholic, with 1,000,000 beautiful historical monuments. In the center, there was a church, and the town had long been in Polish territory. A caretaker was needed to prevent vandals from destroying these monuments. The town took pride in the cemetery as a historical landmark, and even movies were filmed there. So, guarding was required around the clock, and the caretaker had to live in the guardhouse. Well, the grandfather lived there, seemingly taking it all in stride. The grandfather had a peculiar habit. He drank himself to death, and for some reason, his binges always coincided with the beginning of winter, usually matching the first snowfall. His relatives were ashamed of him for this, but my friend was not, because once, just before winter, he fell ill and stayed home. His parents worked at the factory at night, and as a result, the boy found himself under the care of his grandfather, who took him to the guardhouse. It was early December, and it got dark very early. After dinner, they sat down, and my friend noticed his grandfather starting some strange preparations. He took earplugs, vodka, poured himself a full-faceted glass, and drank it. Then, in response to the silent question in his grandson's eyes, he said approximately the following. "Son, plug your ears and don't be afraid of anything. Whatever they tell you from outside the window or the door, pay no attention. Count to yourself or sing a song, just don't be afraid. It happens once a year, and it passes by morning. And why it happens when the first snow starts, who knows, maybe he died then." They sat there together, time passed, and then, around 1 in the morning, someone knocked on the door. The boy was instantly wide awake, listening to the night with surprise. Seeing growing horror in his grandfather's eyes, he could not force himself not to listen to what was behind the door. And behind the door, a thin child's voice repeated monotonously, "Let me in, I'm cold. Uncramped. It's cold where I am." My friend said that neither before nor after did he experience such icy, animalistic horror as that night. There was nowhere to hide from that voice, and falling asleep was completely impossible. So, they sat there until the first rays of the sparse winter sun appeared. As soon as it began to dawn, the voice behind the door fell silent. By this time, the grandfather had drunk himself into complete incoherence, and the boy, finally hearing everything calm down, felt the fear beginning to fade. Then he stood up, put on his shoes, and looked out onto the porch. The sun had already risen, the first snowfall had occurred, and there was no one. Only a chain of tracks from small feet stretched across the snow, from the porch to somewhere deep in the cemetery. My friend followed this chain. He really wanted to understand what they had heard that night. He said that he came to an ancient solitary grave with a fancy Polish name. It was, as he later found out, a local aristocrat who died barely at the age of 30. There was a strange monument on the grave, at first glance, a quite traditional angel with a cross in his hands. However, if you looked closely, the angel had a very ambiguous expression on his face, a smirk of some kind. Local old-timers, who understood everything at a glance when it came to the cemetery, called this place the Bad Grave and flatly refused to say anything about it. Later, someone smashed this sculpture, and only the giant wings lay in the grass. Yes, and my friend's grandfather died soon after, and there were no more volunteers to work at the ancient cemetery.